Hey, welcome to my channel. My name is Michael Mall and this is Beginning Christians. Today's video is about Bible translations and what may be the best for you personally. Bible translations are very complex and they are completed for several reasons. So let's go over some of the reasons before we dive into specific translations. So the first reason is money. Plain and simple, money, right? Publishing companies want their own translations so they don't have to pay royalties for using a specific translation. And the Bible is continually one of the biggest selling books in the world. You won't see it on the New York Times bestseller. You won't see it on anybody's bestseller, but for like the past 100 years, it's been the biggest selling book in the world. So publishing companies tend to make big money off of it. And that's not such a bad thing to make big money off the Bible, because the more money you make off the Bible, it means the more books you're selling and the more that Bibles are making their way in the hands of people who need them and people who will use them and possibly people who will pass them on to other people. So money's a big factor. Two, changes in language. So English constantly changes all the time, right? Words and phrases don't have the same meaning, especially if they were spoken hundreds of years ago. For instance, the word slaps to the older generation is an action which involves physical movement. But to the current generation, my daughters who are 16 and 17, slaps means something is funny. So I tell you a joke and your response is, oh, that slaps, right? Three is new Greek manuscripts. So specifically new discoveries of ancient Greek manuscripts pertaining particularly to the New Testament. When we find these manuscripts, sometimes they confirm a translation and sometimes they refute a translation. So those are three of the main reasons why we see new Bible translations. So in 1611, this will be kind of a history of Bible translations. In 1611, when the King James Version was released, they used about 6 Greek manuscripts to translate it. The earliest or the oldest of those was from the 10th century. Now, this is nearly 1,000 years after the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. The latest or the youngest was from the 13th century. In 1881, the Revised Version was released and used about 2,000 Greek manuscripts. The earliest of these was from the 4th century. So you can see we're getting closer and closer to the time of Christ, or at least to disciples once or twice removed from his ministry. Now today there are well over 5,800 manuscripts, and the earliest date from the late 1st century to the early 2nd century. So now in the late 1st century, we're talking decades after Jesus died, right? So now we are in the century where his apostles are still alive and they are making disciples who will carry these manuscripts into the early 2nd century. So from 1611 till now, we have much more evidence available for translations. And these offer us new insights into old languages. So originally there were about 500 words in the New Testament manuscripts that weren't found anywhere else in the Greek language. This led scholars to believe that the New Testament Greek was a special form of Greek dictated by the Holy Spirit. As a matter of fact, they called it Holy Ghost Greek simply because they had little understanding of the language. Now, since then, we've learned that the New Testament was written in Koine Greek or Common Greek, right? The Greek that everybody spoke on the street. And this led to that number being reduced to 50 words. So now in the New Testament, there's only 50 words that we can't find anywhere else in the Greek. And this is from extra biblical manuscripts, receipts, business letters, things of that sort. So then the question becomes, should we have a new translation that reflects this new knowledge? For instance, we read that Jesus says tetelestai on the cross before he dies. Now, originally this was translated as "it is finished." However, we've learned that there's a deeper meaning to this that we didn't know post King James. And we find this out from receipts, right? From sales receipts from ancient Greece, whether it was somebody bought a goat, or somebody sold a cow, or somebody bought some produce, or somebody bought lumber, they've discovered these receipts, and now they have actually learned that it means the debt is paid or paid in full, right? So this gives it a much deeper meaning than simply it is finished. Because when you hear it is finished, you automatically think, oh, well, it's right. Christ has died. It's finished. But when you read the debt is paid, then that forces you to ask, well, if you're a new Christian, that forces you to ask, well, what debt? What debt is paid? What debt did Jesus pay on the cross? And of course, we know he paid the debt for our sins. Similarly, the phrase only begotten son from John 3:16 is more accurately translated into one and only son. So God's one and only son, or his unique son. So there are actually hundreds of English translations of the Bible. I'm going to review the ones that are most common and most popular. Now, before we start, there's a well-known conspiracy by King James enthusiasts that all other Bible translations dilute or attempt to erode the deity of Christ. This is simply not true. And you may not have heard of this. I certainly didn't know about this for a long time. There's actually people out there who believe that the King James Bible is the only Bible that was inspired by God, and therefore other Bibles are heretical, right? Well, it's not true. So the first thing I'll explain is translation basis, and this addresses what text is used in the translation. So manuscripts found pre and post King James, or manuscripts discovered within the last 100 years. Next, I'll explain translation methodology. Is it a word-for-word translation, or is it a thought-for-thought translation? Word-for-word is a more literal translation, and the advantage is that you get more nuances from the text. You also get exactly what it says, right? If it's a more complicated sentence with careful sentence structure that is trying to communicate important things, you get all that. The disadvantage is that a straight word-for-word translation can yield nonsense because languages don't exactly translate word for word from one language to the other. So if you're bilingual, if you know German or Spanish or any other language, then you're familiar with this concept that languages don't translate straight across, right? There's always something involved, a manipulation of the grammar or a manipulation of the word involved to get the meaning across or to make it understandable, right? Sometimes a translation has to be worked or manipulated. It doesn't change the meaning of the translation, right? So just because we couldn't figure out a certain word in Greek doesn't mean we changed the entire meaning of the whole Bible, right? Doesn't mean the Bible's been corrupted because we had to manipulate, well, not we personally, but because they had to manipulate a couple of words to make the sentence or the verse or the passage make sense. Thought for thought is a more liberal translation, right? In these translations, the exact wording is often changed to preserve the meaning. So Matthew 1:18 is a perfect example of this, right? In this verse, Mary is found to be pregnant or with child. Now, the Greek translation tells us that Mary is found to be having it in the belly, right? She's found to be having it in the belly. Now, you knowing what you know right before I read this, you might say, oh, well, having it in the belly, that might mean she's pregnant. But a lot of people might not know that, right? So this is where thought for thought comes in. The Jews and Greeks would understand this, but as I said before, English speakers might struggle. So the advantage is it's easier to understand, right? They go from Mary was found to be having it in the belly to Mary was pregnant or Mary was with child, which makes it easier for us to understand. The disadvantage to this is that it's easy to miss things because it's simplifying the context. So you lose nuance, right? Now, the first translation to look at is the King James Version, or the KJV. It is an ancestor of most of our modern translations. The KJV, though, is not a translation directly from Greek or Greek manuscripts. It was based largely on the Bishop's Bible, The Bishop's Bible was printed in 1568, as well as other influences from several other English language Bibles. So the KJV is not a direct translation. It's an English to English translation. So if you're going to say that the King James Version is the only version of Bible you should read because it's uncorrupted, well, here's evidence that that's clearly not true, right? It's been translated from other English Bibles that were printed before it. So we see the translators use several other English translations in constructing the KJV. And here's an interesting piece of translation history. The 6 Greek manuscripts that it uses were compiled by a 16th century Catholic theologian named Desiderius Erasmus Rotorodamus. If I pronounce that wrong, I'm sorry. Now, as he was finishing the last verse of Revelation, he only had one source of Greek to use for Revelation. So as he neared the end of the translation, he discovered that several pages of the Greek manuscript he was using had fallen out and were lost. So in his attempt, to complete the translation, he went to the Latin translations to finish it. In doing this, he had to guess at what the Greek words would have been using Latin as a comparative translation and put them in the Greek text. Now, as a result of this, my page does not want to cooperate. As a result of this, this created new Greek readings that don't exist in any Greek manuscripts anywhere in the world. So his translation doesn't exist in any Greek manuscripts, right? He didn't add anything non-doctrinal or bad. He didn't add anything heretical or anything that takes away from the original text. He just added something different in lieu of losing the Greek manuscripts. For example, Revelation 22:19. And if anyone takes words away from the scroll of prophecy, God will take away from that person any share in the book of life and in the holy city, which are described in this scroll. Now, the phrase book of life should be tree of life in the verse. God will take away from that person any share in the tree of life. He used book because it's similar to the Greek word for tree. However, it's not in the Greek anywhere. So both the KJV and the KJV Revised preserved this mistake. Now, shortly after the KJV was printed, they decided they wanted a Greek version of the KJV, and this later became known as the Textus Receptus, or the received text. The translation methodology is word for word. However, it's more literary than literal. So if you've seen the King James, any King James version, it's a beautiful Bible. The pages are full of beautiful, brightly colored illustrations, right? There's illustrations all throughout the Bible, and it's beautiful. The Gothic font just makes it look even more beautiful. It's literally a masterpiece. I mean, I can't read it. I don't try to read it, but just to flip through the pages and look at it, it's beautiful. And this was done to make it look and sound more beautiful, right? The Gothic font makes it look beautiful. The Old English makes it sound beautiful, even if you can get past the these, the thous, the haths, all that, right? So useful facts. It's an extremely well-respected translation. It's a very good translation, but it's not the KJV that is used today, right? The original was printed in Gothic font and then later in Roman font in the hopes of making it easier to read. Ultimately, the most widely used KJV was printed in 1769. It also contains words that are lost to the English language, such as chapter and quaternion, as well as words whose meaning has changed. So the word conversation means a way of life to the Greeks and the Jews. To us, it means a dialogue between people, right? Meet, M-E-E-T, means proper or fitting to the Greeks and Jews. And to us, it means an action between people. I will meet you later, right? Or I'll meet you at the mall, right? The New King James Version was printed in 1982, and the textual basis is the same as the KJV version. So essentially, it's based on itself. The translation methodology is the same because it was essentially an update. The advantage is that the language is updated, so it's really easy to read. The disadvantage is that it's not nearly as beautiful as the KJV. Right, the next is the RSV, or the Revised Standard Version. Now, this was printed in 1952. Its translation basis is the KVJ, or the KJV, sorry, as a starting point, but then they also use the updated Greek manuscripts that had been discovered at that time. Its translation methodology is a mix between word for word and thought for thought, but it leans more on word for word because it's trying to adhere or follow the KJV. At the time, this was a bold move because no one was using thought for thought. It's still archaic in some ways because it's loyal to the KJV. It keeps some of the older style readings, and it has the words like thee, thou, hast, and hath. It is no longer in print, but you still might be able to find it. The next is the new RSV. It was printed in 1989, and it's an update to the RSV. Its translation basis is the RSV, except it's much more thought for thought. Useful facts: it contains less messianic Old Testament prophecies. So if you've read the Old Testament and you have a good understanding of the Old Testament, you know that there are hundreds of prophecies of the birth, the ministry, the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's fascinating. It's beautiful. The Old Testament is full of prophecies about Jesus. In the new RSV, they tend to not highlight the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. They tend to stay away from making them messianic, even though they may. It's considered more liberal because it's one of the first gender-inclusive translations. The NASB, or the New American Standard Bible, was printed in 1995. The translation basis was the most recent Greek manuscripts discovered by 1995. Its translation methodology is word for word whenever possible. So it, like the RSV and the new RSV, will use word for word unless something maybe the translators thought this might be too difficult, so they switch to thought for thought. Useful facts: it is used in more seminaries and scholastic circles than any other. It's very useful for in-depth Bible study because it stays more true to word for word. It's a very good word for word translation. The ESV, or the English Standard Version, was printed in 2001. The translation basis was the most recent Greek manuscripts available at the time, plus the RSV. Its translation methodology is primarily word for word, but it does include thought for thought when necessary. It's like the NASB in its readability, and a lot of NASB readers switched to the ESV. Useful facts: it's the first translation that offers different meanings for the word slave in the Bible. As I previously explained, slavery in the Bible is not the same as America's past slavery, and it addresses this. It also tries to be gender accurate. The Holman Christian Standard Bible was printed in 2004, and it is a brand new translation. It didn't use any versions of previously translated Bibles, unlike most of the ones I've discussed. So this means there's going to be some new readings, but most will be similar. The translation basis was the most recent Greek manuscripts available at the time. The translation methodology is what they call optimal equivalence. Each passage is translated either word for word or thought for thought, depending on its context. So a lot like the ESV and the NASB. Useful facts: it was translated by over 100 scholars. They translate the name of God as Yahweh. This is the most likely English pronunciation for the name of God given to Moses in Exodus. The NIV, or the New International Version, which is the version I use, was printed in 1984, and it's the most popular English translation in the world. The translation basis was the most recent Greek manuscripts available. The translation methodology is primarily thought for thought. This translation is great for understanding the clarity of text. It's not great for in-depth study, as we've said. Word for word is the best for in-depth study. In 2011, it was updated, and all 1984 versions were taken off the shelf. It was translated by very intelligent and thoughtful scholars. Useful facts: the word alien is now translated as foreigner. The word saint is translated as God's people, and it's very gender inclusive. The Living Bible was printed in 1971 and was a paraphrase of the American Standard Version. So let's clarify this. It's a paraphrase and not a translation. A paraphrase is someone's interpretation or opinions, not a direct translation. They should never be labeled as Bibles, but they are labeled as Bibles because they follow the storyline of the Bible. It was the work of one man who didn't use Greek or Hebrew to translate it. He basically read the ASV, which we didn't discuss, the American Standard Version, and then reworded it into what he thought was easier to understand. And it's an interpretation that lacks any scholarly integrity. And the problem is that it's often treated as a Bible. In fact, Billy Graham endorsed it. So during his ministry, Billy Graham went around the country. He was an evangelist spreading the news, and he endorsed this paraphrase. However, the Living Bible made so much money that they decided to update it to the New Living Translation in 1996. Now, this time they wanted to do an actual thought-for-thought translation, so they hired scholars, and they did a great job translating it. So instead of one guy just kind of subjecting himself to the whims of his emotions and his thoughts, they actually hired scholars, and they did a great job translating it. It's great for casual study, but once again, it's not good for in-depth study. Useful facts: if used along with a word for word, it's highly beneficial. So if you use it with the NIV, let's say you get the NIV, and there's some verses that they're just too tough, you struggle with them, grab the NLT, right? And highlight those verses, go to the NLT, and see what the NLT says. It's gender inclusive. It's also great for kids and poor readers. So if you struggle reading the Bible just because you're not a great reader, I'm not a great reader. There's millions of people out there who aren't great readers. Grab the NLT. Now we're going to go. Now I'm going to go into Bible translations. Actually, I don't even think any of these are really translations. These are terrible paraphrases. Terrible. These you should avoid. Now, the Message Bible. It's a horrible paraphrase. It's extremely idiomatic to the point of losing a lot of the meaning from the original text. So here's two examples. Proverbs 1:17. Proverbs 1:17 from the ESV. For in vain is a net set in the sight of any bird. Proverbs 1:17 from the Message. Nobody robs a bank when everybody's watching. Not even close, right? Psalm 1:1 from the ESV. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, or stands in the way of sinners, or sits in the seat of scoffers. Psalm 1:1 from the Message. How well God must like you. You don't hang out at Sin Saloon. You don't slink along Dead End Road. You don't go to Smart Mouth College. Evidently, I need to go to Smart Mouth College. I missed that train. Once again, not even close. Now, I will say, if you are an experienced Bible reader, you can use the Message. if you understand the Bible. The reason why I say that is because I go to a church called Life Church here in Overland Park, Kansas, and our pastor Greg Groeschel, who's a fantastic pastor. He's an awesome pastor. He's inspiring. He's a man of God. He used excerpts from the Message twice. He used excerpts from the Message Bible twice in a teaching series that he did, but both times he used the Message, it was a pretty close reflection to what the verse actually said. So I would never, ever use the Message Bible unless you have a great understanding of a word-for-word translation of a real Bible, because the Message Bible is not a real Bible. It's a paraphrase. It's an extremely poor translation. And how do we know this? One man by the name of Eugene Peterson was responsible for this translation. There you go, one man. He is quoted as saying, "I had to give myself the freedom to just go for it." He also said he translated the Beatitudes in 10 minutes. It's an extremely poor handling of the Word of God, and it tends to add the snicker factor into much of the Bible where it doesn't belong. It seems like he was trying to be clever and witty, but the Bible is not known for being clever and witty. There are instances where Jesus is clever and witty, especially against the Pharisees. The sad fact is that it's neither a translation nor a paraphrase. He's also quoted as saying, "I don't like it when people use these in churches. I've been to churches where they were preaching the Message and I cringed." It is the most idiomatic translation I've ever seen, and it adds colloquialisms where they never existed. There are even passages where the theology is completely missing. And Psalm 1:1, I believe I quoted, was one of those. It was either 1:1 or 1:18. There was only two of them, and I can't remember which one it was. With you don't slink down dead end road, you don't go to smart mouth college. There wasn't even any theology in that. Next, the New World Translation is the Jehovah's Witness authored translation of the Bible. It is the worst English translation in existence. First off, we have no idea who translated it. They won't tell us, right? Countless people have asked over years who translated this Bible, and nobody will tell us. There's like 8 guys who live in New York City. New York City? Yeah, there's 8 guys who live in New York City, and supposedly they're in charge of the entire operation, and they just won't tell anybody who translated. Now, there's rumors of people who might have translated it because people have stepped down in the hierarchy of the Jehovah's Witness and have revealed this information. They did this translation. They did it to, and I quote, "to eliminate the misleading influence of religious traditions which have their roots in paganism." It's a sectarian translation used to preach the doctrines of the JW faith. Its translation basis is the most recent Greek manuscripts that are available within the last 50 years. Its translation methodology is word for word. It's more word for word than the King James. It's clumsy, it's difficult to read, and it's hard to understand because the translators didn't know Greek. Joseph Smith, who translated the Bible, who said he had fresh revelation from God, didn't know Hebrew or Greek. He was the lead translator. We don't know. We know there were several other translators who helped him, but he was a lead translator. He had no schooling in Hebrew or Greek, and yet he said that he was getting all of his revelation from God. So it's the most literal translation available, except the passages where the Bible teaches things that don't agree with J.W. teaching. It combines the worst qualities of word for word and the worst qualities of phrase for phrase. The last translation I'll talk about is the Passion Translation. Now, the Passion Translation isn't finished yet because it's translating the Bible book by book instead of the whole book at one time. So every other translation I've told you about translates the Bible all at once. The Passion Translation is being translated book by book. As I've previously discussed, most translations are done by committees of scholars from different denominations to produce an unbiased translation. However, much like the Message, the Passion Translation is being done by one man named Brian Simmons, who has no training or schooling in translating ancient languages. He doesn't know Greek or Hebrew, and he doesn't have any kind of scholarly background in translating ancient languages. Now, like I said, not having any understanding of Hebrew or Greek, he claims to be getting new secrets from these languages that are unknown to anyone else. So Hebrew, we've been studying Hebrew and Greek for, let's say, 1,500 years to translate the Bible. And all of a sudden, after 1,500 years, after the Bible's been translated by probably some of the most intelligent scholars in history and in the world, he claims to be getting new secrets from these languages that are unknown to anyone else, even though he has no idea how to speak Greek or Hebrew. He says this is allowing him to give the passage new meaning. So when you read a passage out of the Passion Translation, maybe out of Ephesians, and you compare it to Ephesians in any other Bible translation, he adds large amounts of material that have no presence in the Greek or Hebrew. So a chapter of text in Ephesians might have 100 words, but his chapter will have 150 words. So basically, he's just adding more words, and they're not impactful or doctrinal. In fact, they're hyper-charismatic words from what we'd call a signs and wonder movement. So the signs and wonder movement, they're churches that believe in signs and wonders. So they believe in miracles. They believe in the Holy Spirit physically manifesting in a room. Hillsong United is a faith or a signs and wonders movement. They're probably the most well-known signs and wonders movement. He uses words like imparting, triggering, unleashing. You know, in signs and wonders movement, in the signs and wonders movement, it basically tells you that you have the power to make things happen, right? Basically, you tell God what you want to happen, right? So that's where we get words like unleashing, like you unleash your inner healing, right? You trigger your inner faith. I don't know anything about the words, the signs and wonders movement. I just don't. I don't believe in it. It has more intentional changes than the Jehovah's Witness New World Translation. More importantly, Brian Simmons claims that he was visited by an angel named Passion who downloaded fresh revelation into his brain. He also claims that God showed him secrets of the Hebrew and Greek language that no one else knows. Additionally, he claims that he was caught up into heaven and taken to God's library where he was given the 23rd chapter of John. This, of course, doesn't exist. John doesn't have a 22nd chapter, let alone a 23rd. He claims that it is a chapter for future revelation and that he's holding on to it until the appropriate time. This is a bad translation, but for some reason, it's getting more and more popular. So in conclusion, pick a Bible based on your reading and study habits, right? Pick a Bible based on your reading comprehension and your level of interest. I highly recommend any Bible that isn't a paraphrase or a bad translation, such as the Passion Translation, the New World Translation, or the Message. If you need a paraphrase because that's part of your journey, as I said before, you're struggling with phrases or passages, pick the New Living Translation. Although it is a paraphrase, it's a paraphrase developed by thoughtful Bible scholars and not just a single person without any scholarship. Right? Here's a better idea. Pick one of each. Read a word-for-word translation and follow it up with a thought-for-thought translation. How can you go wrong? Thanks for watching. I hope this has been fruitful for you, and have a blessed day.